So this is the last lecture of week 3. We're going to be talking about nature and nurture, and also a bit about a new part of our field called behavioral genetics. So first, let's get some terminology straight. The nature versus nurture debate is super prominent in psychology. And another way of asking that is, what is the role of genetic versus environmental influence? So I want to dive a little deeper into the way they work together. This is also known as a gene by environment interaction. Models of heredity and environmental influences identify 3 key factors: genotype, phenotype, and environment. The genotype is an individual's inherited genetic material. The phenotype is the observable expression of the genotype, including both body characteristics and behavior. And then the environment incorporates every aspect of individuals and their surroundings, other than the genes themselves. So the question that we should be asking ourselves then isn't which is more important, nature or nurture, it's how do genetic inheritance and environmental factors work together to contribute to the individual's personality, or their phenotype, so things like behavior, intelligence, personality characteristics. Now, our genotype is made up of lots of smaller pieces. There's chromosomes. These store and transmit genetic information. Humans have 23 matching pairs of chromosomes, the only exception being the XY pairing that occurs in males. Our chromosomal makeup comes from our biological parents. So one set is from mom and one set is from dad. Geneticists have linked the pairs of chromosomes to different genetic functions. Now that's beyond the scope of this class. Suffice it to say that chromosomes are made from DNA, which is a long double-stranded molecule. It sort of looks like a ladder or helix. That's what you see in the picture on your screen. If we stick with the ladder metaphor, there's lots of little rungs on the ladder, and those are made up of genes. And it's this information that gets stored in our DNA that provides genetic instructions, if you will, or informs how we think, look, act, and feel. So when the forces of genes and the environment combine, which they pretty often do, we end up with what's called a gene by environment interaction. What happens is that individuals might respond differently to the same environment because of genetic makeup. So let's take identical twins. Even with 100% identical genes, there remains an incredible amount of variability in how gene expression can unfold over the course of each twin's life. So maybe one twin will develop a disease and the other one won't. Although they share exactly the same DNA, their unique experiences in life will cause some genes, but not others, to express themselves. So this is why over time, identical twins may come to look and behave differently. On the other hand, similar responses can result from different gene-environment combinations. So maybe children who have vastly different environmental enrichment backgrounds produce the same intelligence test scores. So here you see intelligence test scores from 3 kids, Ben, Linda, and Ron. When the environment is very unstimulating, it's all the way at the left, they're about the same. Now, Ben, Linda, and Ron are not triplets. They have different genetic makeups. But when they're all in the same unstimulating, boring environment, their IQ scores look pretty darn similar, don't they? They're all sort of clustered around about 55. But you'll notice that as the environment starts to change, it starts to get more stimulating. So maybe access to school programs, tutoring, community engagement, we start to see a major difference in IQ. So we see Ben sort of Linda, the orange line, sort of skyrocket up and then drop off a little bit, whereas Ben makes slow but steady increases. Ron actually drops down and eventually comes back up. And they all end up at about the same IQ point in the highly enriched area, but their paths look drastically different. And so this helps to highlight the interactive effect of both our genetic composition, so what makes us up, but also the environment that we are living in. Now, behavioral genetics is the study of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. By examining genetic influences, more information can be gleaned about how the environment operates to affect behavior. Almost all behaviors studied by psychologists are affected by our genetic makeup. And so the question is not whether or not genes are important, but how do they affect these behaviors? We know from thousands of studies using many different methodologies that both genes and the environment are important to understand if we hope to untangle the mysteries of virtually any behavior. Among the interesting questions to be asked now are, how do genes and environments work together to influence behaviors? And what specific genes might be responsible for various types of behaviors? And what's their mechanism of action? The first human behavioral genetic research on intelligence and mental illness actually began in the 1920s. Although genetic research on human behavior continued through the following decades, it wasn't until the 1970s that a balanced view came to prevail in psychology or psychiatry that recognized the importance of nature as well as nurture. In psychology, this reconciliation didn't really take hold until the 1980s. Much behavioral genetic research today focuses on identifying specific genes that affect behavioral dimensions, such as personality and intelligence, and disorders such as autism, hyperactivity, depression, and schizophrenia. Now, heritability is an important concept in behavioral genetics. This is the extent to which differences in the appearance of a trait across several people can be accounted for by differences in their genes. It can be a bit complicated. We don't need to go too far in depth, and I'm going to show you a video on the next slide that does a good job of breaking it down. But heritability estimates only reflect what causes the variation in traits. They don't really say anything about what causes the traits themselves. And heritability is ultimately a statistical estimation of contribution of heredity to individual differences in a specific trait. So it's measured on a scale from 0 to 1, or we could think about it as a percentage from 0% to 100%. And we know that some traits, like height, are highly heritable. There's a high level of genetic linkage between individuals related to their height. But other factors, such as religious affiliation, are not genetically linked. So if a child and a parent tend to have similar religious affiliation, that's more likely to be due to the environmental upbringing. So I want to show you this video by Robert Plomin. He's a renowned behavioral geneticist. He's done a whole lot of work in this area. Is it going to work? No. Okay.
My interest is in behavioral genetics. It's looking for genetic influences on why people differ in behavior. So some people become schizophrenic, some children have reading disability. So I'm interested in what causes those differences. And for a century in psychology, people assumed all that's important is the environment, and especially the environment your parents provided in the first few years of life. That's from Freud onward. But what we've learned using behavioral genetics is that DNA differences between people account for almost half of the differences between people. This is far bigger than all the other effects in psychology put together. So not only does genetics matter, it matters a lot for almost all areas of psychology: mental health and illness, cognitive abilities, personality, school achievement. We call nature is genetics, nurture is environment. So this is the longest standing controversy in psychology, nature and nurture. For a long time, people thought everything that we are is due to nurture. We've shown that nature, genetics, is very important. This goes back 100 years or so when the first behavioral genetic techniques were developed: twin studies and adoption studies. The first ones were done in the early 1900s, primarily in England, but also in other countries of Europe. And the twin method involves comparing two types of twins. 1% of all births around the world are twins. 1/3 of those are identical twins. They're called monozygotic because they're one fertilized egg, a zygote, that They're like clones of one another. They have the same DNA. The other type of twins, 2/3 of all twin births, are called dizygotic, two zygotes. They're like any brother and sister, but they happen to be born at the same time in the same womb. So the twin method consists of comparing these two groups. If a trait, say like musical ability, is influenced by genetics, you'd have to predict that the identical twins are more similar than the non-identical twins. So it's like a biological experiment. And what twin studies have shown us in a recent survey of 15 million twins that have been studied in 4,000 papers, everything is heritable. Not just in psychology, but in physiology, skeleton, bone length, density, everything about individual differences in biology and behavior are substantially influenced by DNA, inherited DNA differences between us. So the twin method is one method. The other method is the adoption method. So the twin method is like a biological experiment. You've got these two types of twins. Adoption is like a social experiment. Nature and nurture run in families. So for a long time, psychologists knew schizophrenia runs in families. No problem. That's the environment. That's because the parents did weird things to them. The parents made them schizophrenic. But they ignored the possibility that genetics is important because genetics runs in families. Parents and offspring are 50% similar genetically. So the adoption method says, let's look for genetic parents and environmental parents. Because kids adopted away at birth, those parents still gave them their genes, but they don't see those parents. They're their genetic parents. But adopted children that are adopted into adoptive families where the adoptive parents are environmentally related. So it's a straightforward, powerful test of genetics because it predicts that these biological birth parents who don't share environment with the kids, how similar are they to the children is a direct test of genetic influence. Similarly, how similar the kids are to their adoptive parents is a test of environmental influence. So the twin and adoption studies have convinced people that genetics is important. So much so that we've now challenged psychologists to come up with any trait that is not heritable. So we've gone from thinking nothing's heritable to realizing everything's heritable. And what we're now doing is using these techniques to study more interesting issues. For example, about development. How early does genetic influence appear? And there have been and the interplay between nature and nurture. And I'll just give an example of that. We have hundreds of measures of the environment that are used in social sciences. Life events, things like financial disruption, stressful life events, are used in several thousand studies. But it's just been assumed that environmental measures are environmental. But what we've shown, many people around the world, these environmental measures show almost as much genetic influence as other psychological traits. And when you start thinking genetically, you say, that's not crazy. What are these measures? It's not the measure of the environment out there, which is the way psychologists used to think of it. The environment's what happens to us. What's going on is that in psychology, our environmental measures are measures of our experience. So life events, it's like financial disruptions, having trouble with relationships, getting in fights with people, losing your job. This is not the environment out there that happens to you passively. You don't have anything to do with it. It's what you do with your environment. And that's where the genetics comes into it. So that's a good example of how a genetic perspective has changed the way we think about the environment. And I believe it's a fundamental principle that the way genes work is through their correlation with the environment, how we use our environment. For example, I study cognitive abilities. The most heritable measure out of the hundreds of measures of cognitive ability is vocabulary. And so people say, so I'm talking about individual differences. Some people have big vocabulary, some people don't. And you don't inherit the words. It's not in your DNA because of different languages, for example. What it is a propensity to use language, to be cognitively aware of the subtleties. I have one grandchild who always wants to know, she's about 7, the nuances. Well, does that word really mean this or does it mean that? I've got another grandchild who said, whatever, you know what I mean, what does it matter, And that's how genes begin to work, is you begin to use your environment. You hang out with people who are like-minded. The one grandchild will be hanging out with other kids who read books, who are interested in intellectual conversations. Language development has been studied a lot. Children differ greatly in how early they learn to speak. Einstein didn't begin to speak till he's about 3. And also how they develop throughout life in terms of verbal fluency, how easy they find it to talk fluently, and also vocabulary. So that's your first language learning. So an interesting question that behavioral geneticists have begun to address is about learning a second language. How does that fit with it? And it turns out that many of the same genes are involved. So people who are good at verbal measures in their first language will tend to be pretty good in a second language. But there are some specific genetic factors. So the bottom line of that research is that about a third of the genetic influences on learning a second language are overlap with the ability to learn a first language. But about a third of the genetic effects are different. And then about a third overlap with just general intelligence. These twin and adoption studies have been used for most areas of psychology that involve individual differences. That is, we're only asking about what makes people different. 99% of all our DNA is the same. We're all identical. But we're asking the extent to which the 1% of DNA that differs makes people different. That's what we're doing in behavioral genetics. We're studying differences. So much of psychology and the life sciences is not asking about individual differences. They're just asking about universal questions about the human species. But we're asking about, why are some kids reading disabled, others not? Why are some schizophrenic and others not? A real transformation of research in this area. Up until now, people have been concerned about just simply asking whether genetics is important, and then asking how important. That question has been pretty much answered across the board. There's some people still don't accept it, but the vast majority of people do. Not only is genetics significant, it's very substantial for almost every area of psychology. That's been so well ingrained that it's no longer interesting to say this trait is heritable, because everything's heritable. We go beyond that to ask questions about development, about the relationship between traits. Like a big issue right now is in psychopathology and mental illness. There's all these different diagnoses. It turns out the genetic effects are pretty much the same. That is, the same genes are causing many of the...
All right, I'm going to stop it there. I think we get the point. But I really like the way that he describes the twin and adoption studies as well, which is what I want to talk about next. So as Dr. Plowman was saying, behavioral genetic studies allow us to examine the presence or absence of a trait among different relatives. And so this helps us to determine how much genes and environment contribute to the cause of the trait. And there's 3 common ways that we do this, which you got an overview in the video. In family studies, researchers examine the extent to which a trait runs in family members who were raised in the same home. The problem here, though, is that in addition to sharing genes, family members also share an environment. So it makes it really difficult to separate out the effects. Is that kid aggressive because they are genetically predisposed, or because their parents are aggressive and then that's what they've learned how to do? So family studies are challenging in that sense. Twin studies compare both identical twins who share 100% of their genes and fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes. And so what these studies can tell us is if there's greater similarity on a characteristic among identical twins, that suggests that the characteristic is likely genetically influenced. Adoption studies examine the extent to which adopted children share traits with their adopted families as opposed to their biological ones. So that lets us tease out the effect of the environment, because even though the children got the genetics from their biological parents, they're not being raised in the same environment. So it lets us really separate them out. So if we see more similarities with the adopted families, this suggests a greater influence of nurture for that particular trait, while more similarities with the biological families suggest a greater influence of nature. We're going to come back to this several times throughout the course. I know this is a bit difficult to wrap your brain around, but this is a really prevalent theme in the field of psychology, and it's one that we'll revisit again and again. And so that wraps up our discussion of biological psychology for week 3. In next week's lecture series, we're going to be talking about sensation and perception.